Hi everybody, how you doing? It's me and Piggy. I just wanted to give you a kind of brief lecture. It should be probably no more than like 15 minutes or maybe a little bit longer. Give you the opportunity to participate in a discussion that we normally would have had and give you some background before you start watching, or maybe even after you've watched Oz and Orange is the New Black. So I wanted to just go over a few things that on our Schoology page, as you'll see, at the bottom of the page, I'm going to try to move it to the top. You'll see a thing for online work and resources. And then in there, there's the week 10 class discussion and the lecture. So I'm just going to put the PowerPoint slides up, even though they'll be in the video, but I want you to be able to go back to them and reference them if you need to. And as you're watching this video, I want to ask you to open up this class discussion. So this is a Google Doc that everybody can edit. If it's weird to do it kind of in this window, you can always click up here and pop it out. But everybody will be able to contribute to this. So what you can do is for each slide, I'll start, hopefully remember in this video to tell you to pause the video and offer your comments. Just write your name in parentheses like I did and then respond. So I think that'll be an interactive piece of this without everybody having to be online at the same time and do a discussion, because I know that streaming and getting everybody together is kind of a pain in the ass. So I'll go through and give you some background in the lecture, and then if you have any questions, you can always just email me or include them at the end of this. The other thing that I did was I put the slide number kind of at bigger numbers at the top of the slide so you can see and it'll be easier to follow. So this week we're going to talk about how popular culture presents experiences in prison. I think we've seen a lot of TVs and movies that revolve around prison life. Next week you're going to watch Shawshank Redemption, which is one of the most famous movies about prison life. And then we'll kind of think about what that means and how it compares to real life, and also how we think about punishment and what people deserve when they break the law. So we're also going to talk about archetypes, meaning like these kind of stereotypical or kind of just figures about typical people that we see, right? So if you think about in schools, right, there's different like groups or archetypes, again, or Argo roles, things like the jock, the cheerleader, the nerd, and so we see the same things in prison. But we want to think about how structural and institutional things in prisons kind of create or exacerbate those ideas. Piggy is just not having this. Okay, there she goes. She's back. Okay, and lastly, I also want you to think about and compare gendered experiences, right? So how women experience prison differently than men and what particular challenges you'll find in each of those. I think next week, for the beginning of it, after you watch Orange is the New Black, I'll give you a few things about what women experience in prison and some of the unique challenges there. So when we talk about prisons, I think that some people tend to use jail and prison interchangeably. And generally speaking, just so that you know, jails in reality are used to house people for really minor crimes or short stays, like maybe a few months, or people awaiting trial. So people who are charged with a crime, who are arrested, charged with a crime, and can't make bail will stay in jail, whereas other people will stay in prison. Right? Prison are for more serious crimes and for long-term incarceration. And then there's different types of prisons, being from minimum security all the way up to Supermax, which we'll talk about in a minute. One of the things that we want to think about are the purposes of punishment, though. Not just things like probation and parole and kind of fines and going to court, but really, like, what is the purpose of sending people to prison? And philosophically, this conversation's been happening for a long time. The first is deterrence, right? We threaten people with jail and prison so that they won't want to commit crimes and therefore think that they're going to get caught and go to prison. It's also rehabilitation, so that we want to fix people so that they'll stop committing crimes. But generally, we know that recidivism rates, meaning after you're released from prison or jail for a crime, there's a very high likelihood of going back for another crime or for probation or parole violations. So we have to think about, like, are we really making people better or fixing them in prisons? The other thing is retribution. We think about that as what we call eye for an eye, or just desert. So people deserve to be punished. They deserve to go to prison when they break the law. Another idea, and this is less common, is the notion of restitution, and that's making right what has been wronged. So, for example, if a teenager goes out and vandalizes a storefront, then restitution and punishment in that sense could be paying back the store owner or erasing the graffiti or the vandalism. So that's also a possibility. And then the last one is incapacitation, so that we want to take violent people out of society and keep them in a place where they can do less harm. So we're incapacitating them, or we're not allowing them to continue committing their crimes. One of the most severe forms of incapacitation is the death penalty, because dead people can't continue to commit crimes. When we think about violent people, though, putting them in with other people who've committed crimes who may not necessarily be violent, we're incapacitating them so they can't commit crimes against society, but they can also commit crimes against inmates. So the question that I want to pose to you, and you may want to stop the video after I ask this, is to think about what we know about prison life. So how do we know about prison, and where do we get this information? So feel free to pause the video here and then go in and jump into the Google Doc and offer your input. Don't forget to put your names in there, else I won't be able to give you credit for participating. But if you forget, you can always go back and add them to your name or to your comments. So the next thing that I want to talk about is that in the most basic sense, prisons are similar in that every single one has goals and objectives for inmates in society. So the objectives or the goals of punishment, the 5 of them that I just talked about, are the same across all prisons, right? We want to deter, rehabilitate, incapacitate, be retributive, and offer restitution. And so each prison generally has its own social structure that's based on laws. Right, so there are many federal and state level laws that dictate how prisons should be run and how inmates should be treated. But then there are kind of customs and ideas about prison behavior. The main differences that we see across prisons are things like the types of services that they provide. Please note that there are distinct differences between federal or state level prisons that are run by the government and private for-profit prisons, which is a whole different mess if you'd ever like to get into that. Also we want to think about work programs, that there are a lot of programs in prisons in which inmates can work. Generally, this is for a significantly reduced pay. It's usually cents per hour, maybe like 45 cents to 99 cents or $1 per hour, that goes into their commissary, or things like doing work outside in the community as long as it's structured. But those kinds of things differ based on the location of it, the state where the prison is located, the types of prisoners that the institution houses, the stringency of custody and security. So again, there are differences between minimum security and maximum and supermax prisons. So those differ. And then the number of inmates. So in the time of mass incarceration, which is sort of tapering off now, but we're still seeing really high rates of incarceration, there has been severe overcrowding of inmates in certain areas. And also something that you want to think about is where inmates are geographically. So in the state of Pennsylvania, an inmate may have committed a crime in Philadelphia, but he could be housed anywhere in Pennsylvania, and be even like 150 miles, 200 miles from his family. So those are just things that you want to consider. From a larger perspective, I want you to think about that maximum security prisons represent social systems, right? That it's an institution with its own rules, laws, and procedures where we're creating and maintaining social control, where we are controlling human beings and what they do. We do this a lot in schools with, let's say K-12 schools, where we're controlling every minute of the day with the children. But even more so that in prisons, it's 24 hours a day. There are even more strict rules. And when we think about solitude, then it's not necessarily solitude, although solitary confinement and the serious consequences of that affect inmates, but also this idea that everyone is together in prisons, right? That it's not necessarily solitude, but the fact that very few people in prisons ever get time alone, that it's life en masse, which we say. So I want to just talk really quickly about Supermax prisons and security measures. And there's lots of information that I could go into about prisons and how they've developed over time. But generally speaking, people are housed in varying levels of prisons and security based on the type of crime that they've committed, but also the threat that they pose to other inmates, to the nation, and for global security. So the picture that I've included here in this is a picture of it's called it's an AdMax prison, or Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, so that you can see it's surrounded by very rough, cold terrain. So even if an inmate were to escape, they would have a very hard time getting very far. So there is no real definition of Supermax, but the main thing that we talk about with Supermax prisons are the length of the term. So generally people at Supermax prisons are there for a very extended period of time. That there is powerful administration, so that administration and wardens and those who govern the prison have more influence and power than at other institutions. That there is a more increased or frequently used solitary confinement to keep inmates from each other. And mostly inmates are very, very severely restricted in terms of their movement and their rights. So generally speaking, if you think about Alcatraz in 1934, the prison on an island, you can go visit it, it's still very cool, but also really depressing, that inmates generally would have had to swim. Many inmates tried to escape and drowned trying to do so. And that was kind of the model for Supermax prisons. Up until 1984, there was only one Supermax prison. It was in Illinois, right? But then in 1999, we had 57 Supermax facilities, right, across the United States, in a number of states, in the majority of states, actually. So we really saw this heightened increased security measures. Examples of people who are in Supermax prisons are kind of large-scale gang leaders, because they have the opportunity to gather and convene inmates, and that could lead to violence. Other examples are people like the Unabomber, the Boston Marathon bombers, so people who have been widely known terrorists. So again, I'm just going to remind you to go back here and fill out some of the discussion questions. I don't want to just have you keep moving through this, but go ahead and pause this and then start whenever you're ready. So when we talk about research that's been done about prisoners, in 1970, John Irwin wrote this book called The Felon, and he had actually robbed a gas station when he was a teenager, and then completed, I believe it was high school and college, through programs in a prison, and then he went on to study prisoners. And he came up with a number of different types of criminals. Again, these archetypes are roles that people can play. Be careful, this was written in 1970s, so this may be a little bit different now. I think some of these are pretty self-explanatory, right? That the thief commits like small-scale crimes, the hustler commits larger-scale crimes, or engages in things like drug dealing, right? That like you want to take or be taken, right? That you need to grab opportunities whenever they're available. Dope fiends are people who are severely addicted to drugs. This one he called the head. Not the head as in somebody who's in charge, but the head as in like a crackhead or an acid head. Again, written in the 60s and 70s, which is a time for like novel drug use. But these are people who really like drugs, like just to get spaced out and like try new things. The disorganized criminal is somebody who just kind of engages in whatever crime they can because they're generally kind of a mess. He also mentions state-raised youth. So these are people who were juvenile delinquents and were kind of worsened by their institutionalization as a child. So they went on to commit crimes. So they've really never been out of prison for any long period of time. The man of the lower class, he calls us, as people who are products of these like delinquent, poor subcultures. So they didn't necessarily know any better and just always commit crimes. And then lastly, he calls them the square johns. So these are people who weren't necessarily traditional criminals and notably different than all of these. So they're just kind of like law-abiding citizens who did something stupid and got caught and went to prison. So I'm going to stop here because I can only make chunks of 15 minutes, but I also like that you can pause and then come back to it whenever you want. So take this time to stop, go back and fill out the discussion questions, go get a snack, go wash your hands, and then I'll continue with part 2.